easy to read, but that's my opinion. Okay, this is where we left, and I will continue from there. So we are still talking about stuff that kind of like wrapping up stuff of language contact, because that's an important area in sociolinguistics. When languages come into contact, they come into contact within a society, and that means that societal factors outside the linguistic factors really enter into the picture and have an impact of what's going to happen. Which language is appreciated, quote unquote, more, which language is not, and that is clearly determined by extra-linguistic factors, not by linguistic factors, because as we have learned in this class, linguistic factors don't have value judgments. All varieties, all languages are equal linguistically. They are able to carry out the tasks that humans everywhere in the world and in all cultures have to carry out, and they are very, all varieties are adequate for that purpose. And this whole notion of having standard languages, prestige varieties, is a socially imposed idea, not linguistically imposed idea. I can't emphasize that enough. So we left here, we talked about language contact. When languages come into contact, it means that speakers of those languages have come into contact, and we had this example of different kinds of borrowings. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs are more easily borrowed than function categories, which are pronouns, prepositions, conjunctions, and so on. And that seems to always happen. You know, English has borrowed one pronoun, and that's they, and its variant forms, them and their. And those were borrowed from Scandinavian. And that fact actually is also societally explicable, because if a language borrows a function element, a grammatical element from another language, it means that those languages are really in close contact, to the point of people of the different languages living probably in the same households, even, you know, marriage bonds and those kinds of things. That's again, it's a societal factor that affects what kinds of things may get borrowed. Structural borrowing also happens, and that requires the existence of bilingualism, and bilingualism happens when both languages tend to be needed for societal purposes. So we had this example of a calque, or a loan translation. The German Kettenraucher is a calque of English chain smoker, and the English worldview is a calque of German Weltanschauung. So literal translation of compound words or idioms. But let's move on. So in the chapter of language contact, you also read about the yes, it's on. Read about the adstratum, superstratum, and substratum languages. What does this mean? That has to do with the perceived prestige of languages in contact, and that leads to different types of change in languages. So adstratum languages are languages that are perceived, those happen when languages are perceived as having equal prestige. For instance, in the medieval England, after the Viking Vikings conquested parts of England, mostly northern, western parts. English and Norse, they were perceived to be equal in prestige. That was, between the 8th and 11th centuries. That's when the Vikings rated several places in England. So those would be regarded as odd stratum languages, and so there's not like, you know, a prestige there, and that basically it happens when we have a conquest, and yet the conquered culture and its language retains its prestige, but the conquering language also has prestige. So English and Norse, the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, they considered each other relatively equal, and that's why that those are both called odd stratum languages. Then superstratum languages. Here we have a dominant group. For instance, if we think about English in today's United States, English is clearly the dominant prestige language in this country with regard to, I would say, all immigrant languages and all other languages, Native American languages, also languages that were here before the English speakers came, and then, you know, all the other immigrant languages. Also, Greek in Greece is considered a superstratum language, and a superstratum language has more prestige and more influence coming from the prestige in this situation than, for instance, immigrant languages. So that's probably very easy to grasp, but that's a grasp that this is the situation, that English in the United States is that superstratum language. Then the opposite of superstratum languages would be substratum languages, the languages of the less dominant group or groups, like in Greek today in Germany and the Netherlands, where Greek is brought to Germany and Netherlands by immigrants. So it's an immigrant, Greek is an immigrant language. But note that Greek in Greece is not an immigrant language. So Greek in Greece is a superstratum language, and Greek in Germany and Netherlands, it would be considered a substratum language. It's the same language, but it's again the relative situation of the people who speak that language with regard to other groups that determines whether a language is a superstratum or substratum language. Spanish in the USA is considered a substratum language because clearly it's not the language that is used in all the situations where English is expected. So it has less prestige socially than English, but again, not linguistically, because all varieties are created equal. Is this clear? So odd stratum equal, superstratum more prestige, substratum less prestige. Pigeons and Creoles. This is a very interesting area, and we have touched upon this a little bit already earlier. You've read about it in chapter 4. Pigeons are simplified contact languages, and they are created out of necessity when people have to start to communicate with each other. Therefore, pigeons do not have native speakers. In theory, it's very easy to separate pigeons from Creoles based on these criteria, but in practice, to say whether a particular language is a pigeon or a Creole, it's more complex. But to know the stereotypical case helps, of course, in figuring out what something might be more a pigeon or a Creole. But anyway, so pigeons, simplified, they do not have native speakers. They're used for business purposes, so to say, whatever is being traded, and out of that kind of a necessity that, you know, we need to communicate, but we don't share a language. Creoles then are languages that have already native speakers. They have acquired native speakers, and in these situations, children acquire, they are exposed, children of pigeon speakers, they hear the pigeon, and since it is structurally quite simplified, what the children, in their wisdom, in their innate push of having a full-fledged language, what they do is they start elaborating on that language. It's kind of an interesting miracle, and the Pigeon becomes a Creole with native speakers speaking that form of Pigeon, and it becomes structurally more complex than the Pigeons. So Creoles develop from Pigeons when Pigeons acquire native speakers, and we have Pigeons. Very often they are based on the languages, the European languages that were the languages of the the people who went from Europe to places that they considered exotic to do trade and so on, and therefore Pigeons and Creoles, they are based typically on European languages. They are based on English. There are English-based Pigeons, French, Portuguese, Spanish, French-based Pigeons all around the world, depending on where those Europeans went to trade. So it's a colonialist concept in a sense. But pigeons are still, there are pigeons that have developed into Creoles in different parts of the world, and I thought I'll give you a few examples of pigeons, how they work. There is a famous pigeon called the Pigeon, and that's spoken in Papua New Guinea. On that part of the world where we find Australia, so in that part, and it's called talk pigeon, but it comes from talk pigeon. So it's the name is a little bit phonologically simplified, which is typical of pigeons. Now, interestingly, talk pigeon is called talk pigeon, but it's actually a Creole already because it has acquired native speakers, and those native speakers have been speaking talk pigeon for several generations already. So, so just to emphasize that pigeons and Creoles that develop from them, they are systematic. They, like all languages are systematic, so are pigeons and Creoles. So, for instance, they are able to express what we in English express with the genitive or possessive. So, man belong quin, and man belong me would be what would man who belongs to the woman, what would that be in English? Husband, yes. And man belong me would be my husband. So so this belong is used, of course, this is an English-based pigeon, so it's used to show possession, and then so it's systematic, and also there's suffixation. So inflectional suffixation. There's the suffix, which is either fella or fella or bella, same suffix, pronounced differently. f and p are both labial consonants, so these are of the same root. And this suffix is used for marking of different things, grammatical things, perhaps in adjectives, but also it's used for marking the number, like numerals. So if we have tupela, blackbella, pig, in talk pigeon is, do you want to guess what it means? It's hard initially. It means two black pigs. So how that is marked is the number suffix. This is the plural marker. So not just two, but tupela, and then black, the adjective, gets that same number marker at also. But of course in English we mark plural in the noun and not in the adjective, and not on the number marker, the determiner. But in talk pigeon it works a little bit differently. So number is marked in the determiner, in the number, and in the adjective as well. And you can see how there's this agreement, number agreement. So you repeat the bella, which initially it came from the word fellow, but it has lost that meaning, and it's just like, you know, here it's a number marker. It's also used as a number marker when they want to say like y'all, you Bella, you two, no can go would mean you plural cannot go. All right, so it's clearer than English in the sense that it refers to you plural cannot go, like y'all cannot go. So whether, and these are just like, you know, quick random examples. What is a pigeon and what is a creole is difficult to decide. Usually there's this historical criterion that means that if a pigeon has been around long enough, it has acquired native speakers and it has become a creole. So if we use linguistic criterion, the linguistic criterion about talk pigeon, it would be a pigeon because yes, it is a little bit simplified if compared to many other varieties. If we use a social criterion, if this is a language that is used only for communicative purposes by people who don't share a language, then it would be also a pigeon. But if we use the historical criterion, it's been around for a long time, since the colonial times, and has certainly acquired native speakers. So based on that, it would be a creole. And these are people don't necessarily agree about these issues, and that's why this borderline of between Pigeon and Creole in theory is easy, but in practice is difficult to define. I have a little paragraph here that shows a pigeon. Okay. And and it's the story of the Little Red Riding Hood, or a passage from that story. So the translation is there below. A long time ago there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood. She lived with her mother and father in a little house. Father worked in the bush cutting trees for firewood, which he sold to people. Now there was a very old lady who lived in another house. This old lady was Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. You know the story. But reading it in a Pigeon here is a little bit challenging, but you can see that there is structure and systematicity to the Pigeon as well. So I'll just read this to you so you can kind of see how a Pigeon would work. Pibo truigat one bella lik meri. Lik little. So there's what is called reduplication. You repeat the same syllable here, lik, because little is has also two syllables, but it has two different kinds of little. Actually, this is the consonant cluster that may cause the need for simplification, or the tendency for simplification. So this process where you take a syllable and repeat that syllable, it's called reduplication. And many Pigeons resort to reduplication in word derivation. Meri is girl, comes from the woman's name. Now nem belong lik ret pela hat. You see the belong possessive again. Name belong her, lik ret pela hat. Little red hat. And here you see the pela suffix used as an adjective marker in front of a noun. Okay. Is ave slip one time mama na papa belong she lived with her mother and father, her father and mother and father. Mama na papa belong mother and father belonging to her, so her mother and father. Long one bella lik house, in a little house. Father worked in the bush. Papa isave walk, long bush, long a preposition there. Isave katim firewood. And by the way, I apologize for my horrible pronunciation of the Pigeon. I'm not a native speaker, so I'm just reading this to give an example. So Papa isave walk, long bush isave cutting firewood, and he cut firewood. Now this language is using the object marker in the transitive verbs. So im is added to transitive verbs to show that this is a transitive verb. So they have extremely fine tuned grammatical rules, just like any other variety, even though there is a certain level of simplification still based on the history of the variety. So Savepain long M. All right. Igat lapun meri. Now, all right, of course, comes this English based, so it comes from all right. Igat lapun meri istaplong narapele house. There was a very old lady who lived in another house. Narapele, pele suffix again shows up there. Dispela lapun emi tumpuna mama. This old lady was the grandmother. Okay, so this just gives you an idea of how you can clearly see the European base language, in this case English, for the Pigeon, and you can also see how, because this Pigeon has developed into a Creole already. It has been established. It has acquired some native speakers. So this comes from Janet Holmes's book Introduction to Sociolinguistics, and just a copy from that the page, and she writes under the translation, most people have predictable reaction to Pigeon languages. They may find them amusing. If you read a children's story in a variety of Pigeon English, it is easy to understand why. It sounds a lot like baby talk, but even if we take a serious article from a newspaper, many speakers of English still find Pigeon languages humorous or babyish. It's difficult for native speakers of a language to overcome these attitudes to pigeons, which are based partly on their language. And just keep in mind that these are languages that it's based on English, but if it's used by native speakers, it is a language where any other language is, and it's not it's not amusing to the speakers of those languages, obviously. So we're back to attitudes that often prevail in these kinds of situations. Of course, in these situations, going back to the Substratum and Superstratum and Substratum languages, the Pigeons were regarded as Substratum languages. So that's part of these things, that attitudinal change is to be hoped for. Okay, did I have any other examples? Your book actually has very nice examples about wings of birds, which are called like hand that belongs to the bird is a wing, and that's how pigeons operate. Sometimes the lexicon is not as large as that of a language that has a long established literary history, for instance, and a lot of borrowing from other languages and so on. So you start with a somewhat simplified vocabulary, but when children acquire pigeons as native languages, those vocabularies are gonna be added to in that process. Okay, and English, going back to English here, English has borrowed from a huge number of different languages, and the process continues. Always when English comes into contact with another language, it borrows from that language. This situation globally is somewhat changed now because English is the power language of the world. It has become, from a language of a small island, England, it has gone all over the world, and it is the most. It doesn't have the largest number of native speakers in the world. Because Chinese would be that language, but it has the largest number of people who have acquired or learned English as a second language. So everybody put together, people who are either native speakers of English or who have acquired or learned English as a second or foreign language, then English is spoken all over the world and is a power language. Of course, what language becomes a power language in the world has to do with not linguistic power initially, but military power, cultural power, and quite often English was the language of the British Commonwealth, the Empire, and people from England, they went to, during colonial times, they went to all these places in the world, and including America, the reasons were always, kind of like, different, but still they brought English here, but clearly, Great Britain was a great power in the world for a long, long time, and then USA started to pick up of that, on that military power thing, and became a world leader, military leader. During the Cold War, there was another big language group that held, because of military power, held a lot of prestige in certain part, or power at least, in certain parts of the world, and that was Russia, the Soviet Union. When, during the Cold War, when America, the USA, and the USSR were kind of like competing in nuclear armament and military might, they were competing of, the ownership of the world in a way, and both languages became widely used in different parts of the world. Russian was acquired, had to be acquired. It was often used as a compulsory second language, foreign language in schools under the Iron Curtain countries, and for English it was more of a voluntary thing in a sense, because despite the fact that the United States also had huge military power and still has, to go with that military power is also the cultural appeal of English, because just to mention, pop culture, the Hollywood, that has gone all over the place in the world, to all the corners of the world, and people kind of admire American culture, admire the cinema culture and whatever that is now. So it's those kinds of things that have nothing to do with language. They end up being associated with the language, and therefore people all over the world start learning these world languages. So now, if we say that English has borrowed from a multitude of languages, now a multitude of languages is borrowing from English. I have been away from my native country for about 30 years, and every time I go back there, I notice that there's more English in the linguistic landscape. Last time we talked about the linguistic landscape. You go obviously at the airport. There's everybody actually even speaks English, and you see a lot of English in the signs, obviously, but even when you go to other places away from the capital, Helsinki, you can see that English has kind of like invaded linguistically. So you go to a small place far away from the capital, and you can see like shops and restaurants and cafes that have English in the names, and it's used in order to sell because English is the cool language. It's considered the cool language. So that's what that has the power. It's the power language. I have noticed that that when I left Finland 30 years ago, nobody used, for instance, yes in a regular Finnish discourse, but yes has just kind of like taken over the Finnish equivalent of yes, and people in normal everyday encounters, they may not be fluent in English, but they would say yes, here it is, and this is what we're going to do. So they use English words. Okay, came actually earlier already. So you take those little particle types of discourse, particle types of words, and they just show the immense cultural influence of English. But back to the fact that English is also borrowed from other languages. Today we can say that English is probably it probably has the largest lexicon of any language of the world because it has borrowed so much from other languages. We may say that English is grammatically simplified, but lexically it's quite expanded. So it started this borrowing way back when. We mentioned the Viking raids, but that wasn't the beginning of borrowing because English took also from a few words from the Celtic languages, because the Celtic languages were spoken on the British Isles before the Angles and Saxons and Jutes went there from continental Europe, and then English was created from that. But here what we have, when the Germanic tribes went to England, an interesting sociolinguistic situation because they were the minority initially, but they did not take a lot from the Celtic languages. Celtic languages like Irish and Scots Gaelic and Cornish and Manx and so on. And Welsh still, Irish and Scots Gaelic, spoken to a large extent. At least Irish and Welsh are spoken quite a bit, but they have diminished over the centuries, obviously. But English did not take from these native languages, excuse me, in the same way as when the English speakers came to America. They did not take a lot from the Native American languages, except when they didn't have a word in order to refer to something that was unique to the United States. It wasn't the United States then, but to North America. Birds and words like possum and a lot of animal flora and fauna related words. They were taken from Native American languages because English didn't have those words. You see an animal you haven't seen before, the options are that you have to sit down and come up with a name for it using your own language's English resources, or just take accept the animal together with its Native American name, because people were in contact with the Native Americans at that point, so they learned those words. So okay, but let's go back to the Viking times, the Viking raids. Vikings came and they left, but many of them stayed in north-west parts in England. You can still see that the very, very common last name ends in son, which is Anderson, Johnson, and we mentioned that already earlier. But that kind of stayed here. But there was this contact, and you took words from the Scandinavian languages like claw, ski, and window, just to mention a few. Window literally means wind's eye, the eye of the wind. Beautiful window for us is just one morpheme, but it comes from a two morpheme word. From French, after the Norman conquest, we've mentioned this before, thousands of words, and also structures after the Norman conquest. So when we pick up words, the contact the language contact may be relatively superficial, but when we start borrowing structures, then the language contact must have been more deeper, more substantial. So words like dinner and dress and fork and judge and jury and miracle and napkin. So a lot of even these examples come from the area of dining, because French, together with the culture that we adopted from the French, we adopted a lot of these terms, a lot of legal terms, fashion terms, administrative terms, military terms, and so on. Latin and Greek, and this happened especially during the Renaissance. Latin and Greek were languages that were prestigious. They were looked up to, and they were related with, associated with education. That if you were an educated person, you knew Latin and Greek, and then through that contact, of course, the literature, Latin and Greek-based literature, was part of formal education. So that was kind of like a good reason to start borrowing from those languages, because if you use these fancy Latin and Greek words, then you sound sophisticated, educated, and so on. So from Latin we took abbot and alibi and bonus and Clark and colloquium and data and extra and spectrum, and the list can go on for hundreds and hundreds of words. From Greek, angel, bacteriology, democracy, philosophy, pneumonia, a lot of medical terminology comes from Greek and Latin, and of course, Greek is looked at as the cradle of democracy. So obviously that particular term also came from Greek. Latin had some kind of an influence even before the Renaissance, because it was the language of the church after the Christianization of England in 597. But not much was trickled down, because of course the Roman Empire had also conquered the British Isles, so they were there before the Angles and Saxons and Jutes came. They were actually, when the Roman military left Britain, then there was this power vacuum, and the Germanic tribes were invited to come there to kind of like hold the peace forcefully, and yet the Roman soldiers had been there for a long time. They left cultural artifacts like the baths and aqueducts and that some of the technology, and yet at that point the borrowing from Latin by the Celts was not that remarkable. It was a superimposed power, clearly a superstratum, but when the Romans left, they took their language with them. We have in England, just one example, Chester is a common ending in many place names in England, like Winchester and Colchester and Worcester and so on, and Leicester, so condensed phonologically, but that comes from Roman or Latin castra, which is like a camp. So some influence even before English started to develop has kind of like, trickled down. But, place names they are different from other nouns, common nouns. But Latin had this huge influence on English during the Renaissance because, you want to sound sophisticated, you want to use these Latin words. Okay, Native American languages we mentioned already, and here are some more examples of the kinds of borrowings that English has taken from Native American languages. Moccasin, moose, muskrat, opossum, raccoon, teepee, totem, culturally related terms, or flora and fauna related terms, and Spanish. There's been a lot of contact during the history of the United States specifically, or North America, and Spanish speakers. And we've got tons and tons of words from Spanish: adobe, cafeteria, guerrilla, matador, mustang, plaza, poncho, tornado, and last time I mentioned the food names that we have borrowed together with the food items. Okay, so societal multilingualism, a few words about that. We as monolingual society as we live in the United States, multilingualism, bilingualism is not really appreciated because English is such a world language that people want to learn English, and therefore people who grow up here don't have to necessarily learn other languages, because you go everywhere and you are able to find someone who can speak English, even though it's not totally always the case if you go far enough from the centers of power in any particular country. The number of English speakers goes down. But we don't often think about the fact, because we live in a relatively monolingual society. We don't think about the fact that the majority of the people in the world are multilingual. You go to Africa, and people speak the village language, their own, perhaps the old tribal language. Their parents may be speakers of different languages, so that gives the child already two languages. Very commonly, people learn the African lingua franca, which is Swahili, and it's used across the continent. And then the language of education is, guess what? English, of course, and people learn that if they go to school. So that gives a number of different languages, and people become fluent in these different languages to varying degrees, of course, like everywhere in the world. India is another place in the world where multilingualism is like a given. People just, so how many languages do you speak? 6 or 7, and it's just, that it's common in India that people know something like 6 languages. And we are like, wow, I wish I knew 2. But it's just, it's the social circumstances. If you have to communicate with different groups of people who speak different languages, and those languages haven't died out, like in multilingual situations they sometimes may. So you learn those languages. English is, Indian English is, again, the language of education, and it's it's kind of, enviable. Because if you learn many languages when you're young, you will know them for the rest of your life, pretty much. So societal multilingualism, it may produce language contact phenomena, and we have already talked about code switching and diglossia. So code switching is the definition. We probably didn't have a definition for that, and again I want to emphasize that in your textbook they prefer to refer to this as multilingual discourse. Well, same difference. In code switching, 2 or more languages are used by multilinguals in the same communicative situation. So that's what distinguishes code switching from diglossia, because in diglossia multilinguals reserve one language for one societal function and the other one for a different function. We'll look at some of those diglossic situations in a moment. But here we have a Spanish-English example about code switching. Within one sentence, one utterance, you have English mixed into Spanish. Es el de México, así los criaron a ellos. Apologies for my pronunciation. My Spanish is very minuscule. Is added there. So he's from Mexico and they raised them like that, So again, we have something that is really easy to borrow. This is a discourse marker, and like that yes or okay that I mentioned that are commonly used in Finland. So you borrow it and you show that also English because because you're using and so it's very convenient within one utterance. And this is just one example. You can find a bunch, or you can go anywhere out here in Huntsville and listen for an hour and you will hear somebody say something like this. So my second example comes from Finnish English. They need extra help, ne tarvii extra help. So here one of my subjects was using extra help. It's kind of like a chunk, and it was convenient to use. It came first to the mind of the speaker. This was a child, and she was referring to some of her schoolmates. So that's code switching within one sentence. We mentioned intra-sentential. These would be, the Finnish English example is a clear example of intra-sentential code switching. I don't really have a good example of inter-sentential between sentences code switching, but anyway, on multilingual discourse. So diglossia. Let's, this is again, it's a prototypical situation, which is actually not all that common in the world in multilingual societies. The term was introduced by Ferguson, I've mentioned that before, already in 1959, and according to him, 2 or more languages or varieties of the same language are used in a speech community in different functions. So you reserve one speech situation for one language and the other one for the other one. And we talked about this, but I didn't really give you a lot of examples of the diglossic situations. A clear diglossic situation where you have the L low variety and H high variety interacting within society, within a multilingual society. In Haiti, Haitian Creole being the L variety and French being the H variety. In Switzerland, Swiss German is regarded as the L variety and Standard High German as the high variety. In Egypt, colloquial Arabic is considered the L variety and classical Arabic is considered as the H variety. So this is a functional specification of H and L. And H and L varieties, they differ in function, prestige, literary heritage, acquisition, standardization, stability, grammar, lexicon, and phonology. And let's talk a little bit more about each. So they differ in function. You go to a particular place, a situation, and you can predict whether you're going to be talking Swiss German or Standard High German, whether you're going to be talking Haitian Creole or French in Haiti. So prestige goes with the H varieties. And this is because of the prestige, not of, again, all languages are created equal. There is no linguistic prestige, but there is social prestige of the speakers of a particular language, and therefore their language gets the prestige designation of the H variety. Literary heritage. The H varieties have typically a literary heritage. They have been written down for a long time. There's literature, poetry, plays, fiction, all kinds of scientific treatises written in the H variety typically, not in the L variety. Acquisition. Children do not learn automatically the H variety. They have to be taught the H variety, but they do pick up, quote unquote, the L varieties in these societies. Standardization. The H varieties are standardized. They have grammars written on them, about them. Grammar books have been written about them. Dictionaries have been written about them. People know what the quote-unquote correct forms are. But in the L varieties, that's not the case. There's a lot more variation in the L varieties because they are not standardized or codified. Just an example, I have worked a little bit with the sociolinguistic issues with the Alabama Cachada Reservation here in Livingston, and they still speak Alabama and Cachada there. Predictably, the older you are, the more likely you are to speak either Alabama or Cachada or both, but English is taking over there, and despite the efforts of the tribes to keep their native languages also going, because of a long history of children being sent to boarding schools where they were punished for using their native languages, and they didn't want to pass their native languages to their children. I interviewed a lot of people there, and they said, we don't want to pass this my native language to my kids because I don't want them to have to go through the same thing I had to go through. I mean, they told these stories that their mouths were washed with soap if they used their native language, or their names were written down on the board and so on. That soap washing of a little Indian child for using his or her native language is a powerful and horrible metaphor of making a child feel that this is a dirty language. I got my mouth washed with soap when I used bad words when I was a kid, so that was much more legitimate. But anyway, I think that happened once, and I always remember it. So I can just imagine how it would be if I were punished for using my native language or my native dialect. It's horrible. But anyway, so the people there on the reservation, they say that we don't always know what the form of a particular word should be because there's variation from house to house, from family to family, because the languages have not really been standardized. Relatively recently, there are linguists have worked together with the people on the reservation, and there is now a grammar and a dictionary of Alabama and Coshada. There are dictionaries for both. I forget which one had the grammar book. Probably Khorassani. But anyway, so there are these attempts for standardization. The people on the reservation say, hey, if we don't know what a word is, or how a word, quote unquote, should be formed in Alabama, for instance, because the neighbors use a different word, what we do is we pull out the dictionary that was written sometime in 1990, relatively recently, and they use the dictionary as the guiding force. So that's kind of like, beginning the process of standardization, and that's what standard languages they have. They have these kind of like the guidance in the form of a dictionary or grammar book. Stability is another feature that distinguishes the H varieties from the L varieties. Related to what I was just saying, the high varieties are more stable, and there's more variation, more instability in the L varieties because they haven't been codified or standardized. Grammar and lexicon and phonology, those we can find differences there as well. So let me ask you, which one is an H variety? Whether an H variety will be used or whether the L variety will be used in this kind of a situation if we have a diglossic kind of multilingual society. Sermon in church. The H variety. Yes. Sermon in church because that's kind of like a more formal situation. Instructions to servants. High variety or low variety? Low variety. Personal letter. It does, exactly. It depends whether it's, usually the L varieties are not written down necessarily. So even in a personal letter, if a person can write, a person probably knows the high variety and will probably use the high variety in a letter that is going to another person who knows the high variety. However, if the L variety has already acquired or has been, become a written variety, then of course, if you're writing to your buddy very informally, then it would be the L variety. Political speech, high or low? High, yes. University lecture, high. Conversation with family or friends, low. News broadcast? High, yes. Radio soap opera? Or TV soap opera?
Like a television show?
Probably the L variety because it's lighter, more informal, as opposed to if we consider news broadcast and soap opera. So, or sitcom, I think we would say, call it here in America. So the L variety would be more likely there. Newspaper editorial. High. Poetry.
Depends on the poetry.
Depends. Yeah. If we go back, if it's like high poetry, then it would be the high variety. If it's more informal, to make a point or what have you, and this we'll talk just a little bit about that, then it would be the L variety. Folk literature, like a fairy tale or something that has been collected from people. More likely the L variety, right? Yes. So fancy literature, H variety, and then more down-to-earth literature could be the L variety. I just had a graduate student finish his master's thesis, and he wrote it on Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Are you familiar with that work? Yeah, The Color Purple, and it's by an African American author, and what she chose to do was to use black English vernacular as the voice of the main character, Celie, in that literary text written in the early 1980s. And it was something that had not really been done to that extent earlier. I mean, of course, we have Mark Twain, who writes African American, his black characters use African American vernacular, and so it's not like it was not unprecedented, but Alice Walker kind of made this point, and this was my student's point, that she wanted to take a variety that is kind of, this is a variety that is not a standard variety of English. We don't have a diglossic situation here because we can never predict which variety is going to be used. But anyway, it would be more like the L variety, right? And what Alice Walker did is she took that L variety and put it into a context where you expect an H variety, which is standard English. And what my student's argument was that she was, while doing that, she was making a point that this is a variety that is worthy of literature. And on that I will end. So we'll talk a little bit about code switching and borrowing next time. But thanks, and have a good rest of the day. Enjoy the readings. Okay.